Sequels have always been a divisive subject in Hollywood. When they're good, they're great, and when they're bad, they are the worst. Sometimes sequels can be a natural continuation of a story we love, like Back to the Future.
Great Scott!
But when they're done for all the wrong reasons, they can ruin the whole franchise. For example, when a movie is a box office smash and the studio just wants to make a ton of money, so they force out a sequel that really shouldn't exist at all. Today we're taking a look at movie sequels that were rushed into existence that would have been way better off left alone. In 1999, The Mummy hit theaters and was an almost instant smash hit, which is probably why, only one day after it was released and started raking in that serious cash, Universal Studios greenlit its first sequel, The Mummy Returns. One day! It had been a long time since Indiana Jones had captivated audiences.
Oh, rats.
And a few years before Angelina Jolie would bring back Lara Croft to the big screen. So audiences everywhere were completely taken by a story of an ancient Egyptian mummy being awakened from its tomb and wreaking havoc amongst those who dare to disturb its slumber. It was a massive box office success and the perfect summer action movie. And yet, when they tried to strike gold once again with The Mummy Returns, things didn't go quite as planned. Sure, the sequel also made a lot of money, but most reviewers agreed that the filmmakers had traded story and character for more special effects and big action sequences. It's still a super fun movie to watch, but it just didn't have enough time to be developed into the well-rounded movie that it could have been. They were never quite able to capture the same magic as the first movie, even though Universal tried their hardest to keep making mummy movies work. When Daniel Craig first strode out of the ocean in a Speedo as the new James Bond in Casino Royale, he made it clear that he has a brand new kind of Bond for the 21st century. And it worked. He was a hit. Not only did fans and critics alike adore Craig's take on the iconic role, but the movie itself was highly praised as one of the best of the entire franchise, ushering in a newer, grittier kind of Bond that we'd never seen before. Previously, the character had always been notoriously smooth and perfectly mannered with never a hair out of place. This new James Bond was a whole different creature. He got seriously beaten up, was a little unpredictable, and was all the more dangerous. Which is why it's clear that the studio wanted to capitalize on the hype as quickly as possible, putting out the second of the series, Quantum of Solace, into production before the first was even released. Unfortunately, the stars did not align in the same way twice, as it all went down smack dab in the middle of the 2008 writer's strike. With an unfinished script and super rushed shooting schedule, Quantum was met with far less favorable reviews than Casino Royale, and was a bit of a disappointment after the first movie set the bar so high. Long before Todd Phillips made headlines with his gritty ode to Martin Scorsese film The Joker last year, he was most well known for directing The Hangover, and then The Hangover 2, and then The Hangover 3. The first Hangover movie surprised audiences and critics everywhere with how completely hilarious and awesome it was. Clearly everyone involved in the making of it had the best time of their lives shooting the film, and it was that combined with the massive amount of money it brought in at the box office that spurred on its sequels. In fact, plans to unite the Wolfpack for a second adventure were already in the works even before the first one hit theaters. The only issue was, The Hangover 2 was kind of the same movie as The Hangover, only this time in Thailand. It even followed the same premise of having to find one of the guys who had gone missing after a night of heavy partying. And while it had funny moments, audiences everywhere couldn't help but be a little bit let down by all of the recycled gags. That being said, we will never get tired of watching the Wolfpack get into trouble. It's almost hard to remember now that the MCU was such a dominant force in the box office that it all started way back with a little movie called Iron Man. A little $20 million student film, as Jeff Bridges put it, with no script and a lead actor that major studios had long since given up on. It was the very first movie that Marvel Entertainment made independently of another studio, and lucky for them, it paid off. Huge. As soon as it roared into theaters, Iron Man was quickly recognized for what an awesome achievement it was, and took in almost $600 million at the box office, which back then was a big superhero movie. With all of that success under their belt, Marvel jumped into production for a sequel immediately after Iron Man came out, this time bringing on Justin Theroux to write the script alongside Robert Downey Jr. While the movie still ended up being a lot of fun, it didn't garner the same enthusiasm from both fans and critics, and even though we could watch RDJ play Stark forever, it lacked in some of the story elements that made the first one so amazing. When The Purge first hit theaters, it was clear that it was going to be a huge moment for Blumhouse and for horror movies in general. It was a fascinating concept that audiences everywhere connected to for different reasons. The idea of a worst-case scenario of what could happen when political, social, and financial tensions hit their breaking point in a not-too-distant version of America. The first movie centered around a lead character who had become wealthy by designing advanced security systems for other wealthy people to protect them from the annual purge, in which all crime becomes legal for 12 hours once a year. It directly dealt with the huge wealth inequality gap in the United States and what happens to those on the outside who can't afford the same kinds of protection. Right away, the movie proved to be such a huge success that Blumhouse set out making its first sequel, The Purge Anarchy, right away. This time, they set the action in Los Angeles, and rather than keeping the story contained in the way the first one did, they expanded it to the entire city and took it to the streets. While it still had its fair share of terrifying moments and smart concepts, some felt that it lacked the same subtlety as the original. Back in the time when comic book movies weren't the dominant force at the box office, everyone was talking about Batman. The first two Batman movies, directed by Tim Burton, were huge hits, and were the first times that audiences had seen some of their favorite characters brought to the big screen. Then, in 1995, Warner Brothers handed the reins to Joel Schumacher for Batman Forever, and requested that the film be a whole lot more on the family-friendly side than the first two installments.
I'll get drive-through.
Michael Keaton was replaced by Val Kilmer, and Jim Carrey gave us one of his best performances as
The Riddler.
It was a big financial success for the studio, and right away they commissioned another sequel from Schumacher, Batman and Robin. Because the studio was in such a rush to make those sweet Batman box office dollars, they pushed Schumacher to make the movie as quickly as possible, and to make it decidedly for a younger audience. The result is pure camp, right down to the infamous anatomically correct batsuit. It was reviled by critics and fans alike, so much so that the whole cast and Schumacher himself have actually apologized for making the movie. There is no genre that Hollywood enjoys making tons and tons of sequels for quite so much as horror movies. Franchises like Saw, The Purge, The Conjuring, and Friday the 13th, among others, seem to just keep on going, sometimes for decades. But one of the franchises that has reinvented itself more than just about anyone is, without a doubt, Halloween. While the most recent revival definitely breathed new life into the story of Michael Myers, there is one sequel that stands out above the rest as the most reviled: Halloween 3, Season of the Witch. Fans everywhere were totally satisfied with the ending of Michael's story after Halloween 2, and felt that there was just no logical reason for it to keep going. And yet, it did, with a confusing new story that didn't make much sense at all. We've mentioned quite a few sequels so far that started production almost immediately after the first one was released, but sometimes they actually shoot two movies at the same time. This is the case for the original Superman, and then Superman 2, starring Christopher Reeves as the Man of Steel. In a very confusing move, the studio ordered director Richard Donner to film both Supermans, or Supermen, at the exact same time. Donner got 75% of the way through Superman 2 before he was replaced by Richard Lester, who wound up reshooting over 3/4 of the movie. If it all seems like a total waste of time and resources, that's because it is. The first Superman was widely beloved, and while the second got decent reviews, it just didn't quite stack up, probably because of that rushed and confusing shooting schedule. Scary movie. Every millennial remembers the experience of watching the infamously audacious horror movie satire for the first time. It was really the first of its kind, and it was actually a great movie. It perfectly set up all of the 90s slasher movies that had come before, from Scream to I Know What You Did Last Summer and everything in between. It was lewd, crude, extremely gross, and so much fun. In the year 2000, it was absolutely the movie to see, which is why it made a ton of money at the box office, and doing what they do best, the studio ordered a sequel to be released less than a year after the first one came out. Weirdly enough, the first had been released with the tagline, "No mercy, no shame, no sequel," and they probably would have been better off sticking to that motto, as the second Scary Movie earned way less at the box office and was a critical flop, and we're not even going to get into the rest of the franchise. But for better or for worse, we wouldn't have a Scary Movie at all if it wasn't for the movie that kicked off the 90s slasher craze in the first place, Scream. Not only did the movie reignite public interest in the entire horror genre, it also restarted the iconic career of Wes Craven, who had made a name in horror in the 80s with classics like Nightmare on Elm Street and The Last House on the Left. With an all-star cast of young Hollywood up-and-comers, Scream is credited with subverting the slasher genre by playing with all of the tropes that audiences had come to expect from movies of the previous decades. It made a massive impact and a lot of money, so they set about making a second movie. Writer Kevin Williamson already had a good idea for the second movie while making the first, but in a devastating turn of events, a huge portion of his script was leaked online, forcing him to start from square one. Despite all of that, they managed to rush out Scream 2 less than a year after the first one had made history. While it still made a splash at the box office, it definitely pales in comparison to the groundbreaking first film. So many sequels, so little time. What did you think of this list? Are you a fan of any of these sequels? Or do you think that they should have been given more time to develop? Did we miss any awesome ones that we gotta know about? Let us know down below. And don't forget to hit subscribe to keep up to date with the latest videos from ScreenRant.